The movie begins on a cold winter night as an 8-year-old boy named Henry heads home with his mom at the steering wheel. As the car drives through a deserted highway, the duo sings various Christmas songs as they celebrate the festive period. Sadly, their joyous mood is short-lived as a truck appears out of nowhere and speeds towards them. Henry's mom desperately tries to steer the car to safety, but the truck jams into the vehicle, causing it to swerve on the road. The duo is left with minor bruises, but the danger is not averted as the speeding truck with failing brakes heads towards them again. Seconds before the truck hits the car, something strange occurs. A frightened Henry slowly fades into thin air, leaving his clothes behind as he magically time travels 2 weeks into the past. There, Henry finds himself in his house and shockingly watches his younger self playing with his mom and dad. Before the young boy can process the strange occurrence, he suddenly returns to the present. But this time, he reappears outside the car and helplessly watches as the trailer crashes into his mother. Henry tries to run to the accident scene, but an unknown man stops the young boy and offers him a blanket. Wasting no time, the strange man explains that he's a future version of Henry, thus revealing that he is a time traveler. After disclosing this information, the grown Henry leaves his clothes behind as he returns to the future. In the next scene, we see an adult Henry appear in a library as he puts on some clothes and heads to the common room. Moments later, a young woman arrives at the library and spots Henry. She excitedly approaches him and introduces herself as Claire. The attractive woman tells Henry they've met before, but the adult time traveler doesn't find her familiar in any way. To ease his confusion, Claire explains that his future self often visited her when she was a child. Yikes! Despite the explanation, Henry remains puzzled by the stranger. Seeing this, Claire volunteers they grab dinner together so they could continue the conversation. Henry accepts her invitation and they schedule to meet at a nearby restaurant by 8. At the agreed time, the duo meets and Claire tells Henry all about her encounters with his future self. She explains their last meeting was years ago and expresses her excitement over seeing him again. After their date, they head over to Henry's apartment and things quickly get steamy as the couple passionately makes out. The next day, Claire invites Henry to her apartment and introduces him to her roommate's boyfriend named Gomez. The group shares dinner, after which Henry eventually retires for the night. Later that evening, Gomez walks down a busy street, but abruptly stops when he notices a fight going down in an alleyway. Upon inspection, Gomez discovers that one of the fighting men is actually Henry, dressed in women's clothes. A confused Gomez quickly breaks up the fight and asks the time traveler what was going on. But Henry simply ignores him and breaks into a nearby office, with Gomez following closely behind. Desperate for answers, Gomez confronts Henry and pesters him for an explanation. Right then, the time traveler finally reveals that he is an older version of Henry who came from the future. It turns out that Henry has no control of his powers and randomly gets teleported to a new timeline every few weeks. A major downside to this ability is he has no control over the past or future, as all he can do is witness events, but never has the power to change them. With every teleportation, Henry loses his clothes and has to wear any available outfit, thus explaining why he was wearing women's clothes. Naturally, Gomez finds this story laughable and instantly disbelieves him. However, Henry's powers immediately activate and he disappears into thin air as Gomez watches in disbelief. Startled, he swiftly races to Claire's apartment and warns her about Henry as he recounts the night's events. But to his greatest surprise, Claire reveals that she's aware of Henry's powers and asks him not to worry. Meanwhile, we discover that Henry had time traveled several decades into the past. Prior to the accident at the start of the movie, he enters a train and spots his mother quietly sitting on one of the chairs. An adult Henry struggles to control his excitement and introduces himself to her while she stares at him in confusion. Henry awkwardly converses with his mom, but is careful not to reveal his secret to her. The train eventually hits a stop as Henry bids his mom a final farewell as he alights from the vehicle. On returning to the present, Henry gets his mother's wedding ring from his dad and proposes to Claire. The young woman is shocked by the proposal but accepts it nonetheless as the couple shares a kiss. Months later, the day of the wedding finally arrives. Gomez, who has grown rather fond of Henry, is chosen as the best man and helps the groom to prepare for the ceremony. Sadly, as Henry steps into the bathroom to make some finishing touches, his uncontrollable power activates, causing him to vanish. Meanwhile, Claire's bridesmaid arrives to check on the boys and repeatedly knocks on the door. Gomez immediately freaks out but manages to buy Henry some time as he stalls the bridesmaid. Fortunately, Henry reappears a few minutes later and arrives in time for the wedding. The priest eventually pronounces the couple man and wife, and a reception is held shortly after. Henry and Claire take the center stage as they romantically dance while professing their love for one another. At the end of the night, the couple retires to their suite and plays around in bed. However, this doesn't last long as Henry's ability activates once again, prompting him to disappear. Claire is saddened by this and spends the rest of her wedding night alone waiting for Henry's return. Fortunately, he eventually comes back, but in the early hours of the next day. Over time, the constant, spontaneous disappearance becomes a part of the couple's lives. Some days, Henry's gone only a few hours. On others, he leaves for weeks at a time. At first, Claire is pretty understanding as she realizes that Henry has no control over his powers. But her patience eventually runs thin when Henry disappears and misses the holidays. On his return, the couple gets into a small fight about it, which ultimately ends with Claire leaving for work. After completing her shift, Claire finds Henry outside waiting for her. The time traveler takes her to a nearby viewing center where the numbers of a national lottery competition are being announced. Henry hands Claire a ticket and watches her stunned face as the presenter announces all the numbers on the ticket. Claire realizes they've won $5 million and looks on in shock. Seeing this, Henry apologizes for his recent disappearances, noting that it feels like a curse, but he explains that it can also be a gift. Hearing this, Claire forgives him and the couple makes up. Days later, they cash in on the lottery and buy a new house as they settle in. One afternoon, the couple invites Gomez and his girlfriend over for brunch. In the kitchen, the group hears a large noise from the living room and proceeds to check it out. To their utmost shock, they find a future version of Henry with a shot wound in his gut, dying on the floor. Before the group can react, the wounded Henry disappears into thin air and returns to his timeline. Claire and present-day Henry are horrified by the sight and discuss what they just saw. As they converse, Claire reveals she's pregnant and asks Henry to seek medical intervention to cure his spontaneous time traveling. Scared that he'd miss out on his child's life, Henry heeds Claire's advice and seeks out a geneticist named Dr. Kendrick. Henry schedules a visit with him and explains his condition to the scientist, but an ignorant Kendrick assumes he's being pranked and dismisses Henry, prompting the time traveler to storm out in annoyance. Days later, Claire is having a dinner in a restaurant when she suddenly starts bleeding. She makes her way to the hospital and Henry arrives shortly after. Claire informs Henry that she had a miscarriage and the couple mourns the loss of their unborn child. In the following scene, Henry returns to Dr. Kendrick and tells him about his wife's miscarriage. He theorizes that the baby may have also been a time traveler who left Claire's womb, thus causing the miscarriage. Dr. Kendrick believes Henry to be insane and dismisses him once again. But this time, a persistent Henry convinces the doctor to run a test to confirm his claims. Dr. Kendrick has Henry take a CT scan, and the time traveler disappears during the test, thus proving he can indeed time travel. When Henry returns, Dr. Kendrick confirms his theory and tells Claire, alongside Henry, that his time-traveling genes were the cause of the miscarriage. Henry is overwhelmed with guilt, and this drives him to have a vasectomy without Claire's consent. After the procedure, he comes clean and tells her about it. Claire is upset that he had the operation, and the duo gets into a heated argument. Later that night, Claire receives a text from a younger Henry who time-traveled to the present. She drives over to pick him up, and the couple ends up doing the nasty in their car. Weeks later, Claire discovers that she's pregnant and breaks the news to her husband. The time traveler is puzzled by this as he had a vasectomy to stop her from getting pregnant. Seeing his confused expression, Claire tells him of her steamy encounter with his younger self and explains that he got her pregnant, and it is technically not cheating. Henry is terrified by Claire's pregnancy and fears that she could have another miscarriage, but Claire remains hopeful and is confident that the baby will survive. Days later, Henry has one of his spontaneous episodes and travels to the future. There, he meets a young girl who runs up to him and calls him Daddy. Right then, we discover that Claire's pregnancy was successful as she bore a beautiful girl named Alba. Alba takes a walk with Henry and tells him all about her life in the future. It turns out that she is a time traveler just like him, but unlike Henry, she has the special ability to control her travels. The proud dad is overjoyed to hear this, but their meeting soon takes a dark turn when Alba discloses that Henry died when she was 5 years old. The news troubles Henry, but he puts on a brave face and eventually bids Alba goodbye as he returns to the present. Henry tells Claire about his meeting with her daughter, but leaves out the part about his death. Claire is relieved to discover that she won't have another miscarriage and goes on to carry Alba to term. Years later, Alba finally turns 5, and Henry grows worried about his death date. One day, he returns from his travels with an injury on his foot. Claire rushes him to the hospital and, luckily, he survives the injury, but uses a wheelchair for the next few months. After he's discharged from the hospital, Henry travels again, but this time to his death day, which happens to be during the winter. He appears on his house porch and hears Claire screaming from a distance. He looks through the door and sees himself dying in the living room as his family watches helplessly. Henry places his hand on the door and leaves a handprint as he returns to the present. The scene shifts to Christmas Eve as Henry and the rest of the family invite some friends over. Henry realizes that he's a few hours away from his death and makes final preparations. He thanks Gomez for being a good friend over the years, and the duo says their farewells. Afterward, Henry finally comes clean to Claire and informs her of his impending death. Claire is devastated by the news, but eventually kisses Henry as the couple says their goodbyes. Moments later, Henry time travels again, and this time he arrives at a hunting ground. A pair of hunters mistake him for a deer and shoot at Henry from a distance. The bullet pierces his gut and jolts him back to the present as he lies on the floor of his home. Claire immediately rushes to his side and helplessly watches as Henry bleeds out. Meanwhile, a handprint appears on the house doors, indicating that the past Henry had witnessed the tragic event. Years after Henry's passing, Claire and Alba move on and learn to live without him. One day, as Alba plays on a field with Gomez's kids, a time-traveling Henry from the past appears. Alba instantly races to him as father and daughter reunite. While they do this, Gomez's kids run off to inform Claire of Henry's return. On hearing the news, Claire races to the field and jumps into Henry's arms. After exchanging pleasantries, Henry reveals he can't stay for long as he's merely time-traveling from the past. Despite wanting him to stay, Claire understands and kisses him one last time right before Henry disappears into thin air. The movie ends with Claire and Alba returning home with cheerful smiles as they finally got to see Henry one last time. And that's a wrap for this movie recap. Thanks for watching.